Above Ukraine, the skies seemed calm, almost eerily so. But deep underground, inside the hardened hangars of Kulbakine airbase, the tension was so heavy it could be cut with a knife. One aircraft, one mission, two precision bombs, and one target. A target so critical that the entire southern front hinged on its destruction. This was no movie script. This was reality. In modern warfare, decisions measured in seconds can outweigh decades of weapon development. Imagine this for a moment. A bridge built over decades, reinforced and fortified until it became a symbol of indestructibility. Every day it carried fuel, ammunition, armored convoys, the very lifeline of an invading army. And then, in just 23 minutes, it ceased to exist, reduced to twisted steel and burning debris, sinking into the river below. Some might call it luck, but for the pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers behind the mission, it was the result of cold, methodical calculation. Every move was deliberate, every variable measured, every risk accounted for. On this day, a Ukrainian MiG-29, a jet nearly 45 years old, armed with two modern GDMR-guided bombs, slipped through layers of Russian air defenses and obliterated a structure that funneled supplies toward Melitopol, Zaporizhia, and even Crimea. This wasn't simply an airstrike. It was a surgical cut to the enemy's logistic artery, executed with chilling precision. Long before the MiG-29's engines roared to life, the mission had already begun. Weeks of reconnaissance had gone into identifying the target. Satellites tracked every movement across the bridge. Fuel trucks rolling one after another, artillery convoys, and armored vehicles bound for the occupied south. Ukrainian intelligence carefully logged schedules, noting peak usage times, patrol intervals, and even when Russian engineers inspected the structure. The conclusion was clear. This bridge wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was a lifeline, feeding entire sectors of the Russian front. Destroying it would paralyze supply chains across Zaporizhia and isolate Russian units closer to Crimea. The chosen weapon. The aircraft of choice was an aging MiG-29 Fulcrum, once the pride of Soviet air power. It had been upgraded with Western precision technology. The centerpiece of the strike was a JDMER bomb, a joint direct attack munition with extended range, guided by GPS, capable of hitting its target within a few meters of accuracy. Two such bombs were mounted beneath the MiG's wings. Each carried enough explosive force not only to tear through reinforced concrete, but to collapse the bridge entirely if placed at critical weak points. The task was surgical. Strike precisely where the structural integrity was most vulnerable. Timing the operation, the window for attack was narrow. Russian radar coverage and air defense systems were strongest at midday, weakest in the late afternoon, just before rotations. Analysts pinpointed 1425 as the optimal moment. Patrols would be shifting, electronic jamming would be minimal, and visibility was perfect for guidance systems. The pilot was briefed to the smallest detail. The flight path was calculated to weave through gaps in radar coverage, skimming low over terrain, climbing only at the final stage to release the bombs at the ideal trajectory. Inside the hangar, inside the Kulbakine airbase hangar, silence hung heavy. Mechanics gave final checks. Engineers loaded targeting coordinates, and the pilot sat in the cockpit, running through the checklist in his head. Every movement was routine, yet everyone knew the stakes. Failure meant more than a lost aircraft. Failure meant the bridge would continue to funnel fuel and ammunition to Russian troops. It meant more Ukrainian soldiers facing artillery fire tomorrow, more cities shelled, more lives lost. Success, however, would change the balance, at least for a time, across the entire southern front. As the canopy lowered and locked into place, the pilot gave a final nod. The engines thundered to life, rattling the hangar walls. Ground crew stepped back, saluting as the MiG-29 rolled forward. At that moment, it was no longer just an old Soviet fighter jet. It was the spearhead of a mission that could decide the fate of thousands. The countdown had begun. The MiG-29 tore into the sky with a roar, banking low and fast over the Ukrainian countryside. Flying at treetop level, the jet used the terrain as a shield, hugging valleys and ridges to stay hidden from Russian radar. Every second mattered. The longer it stayed undetected, the greater the chance of success. The pilot's visor reflected the glow of digital displays. Speed, altitude, distance to target. His pulse was steady, but his mind raced. Somewhere ahead, Russian S-300 and Buk missile systems scanned the skies. He knew they were waiting, ready to fire at the first trace of his aircraft, dancing with the radar. At 14:19, the first warning blip appeared on the threat receiver. Russian radar had locked briefly, then lost him again as he dropped altitude. A Buk battery near Melitopol had tried to track him, but the MiG's low-level flight kept it blind. Seconds later, anti-aircraft guns opened fire in the distance, tracers arcing skyward into empty sky. The pilot didn't flinch. He stayed on course. The final approach. At exactly 14:24, the river and the bridge came into view. A massive structure of steel and concrete, crawling with Russian vehicles. Trucks lined up bumper to bumper, waiting to cross. Fuel tankers and armored transports crept forward, unaware of the doom screaming toward them from the sky. The pilot pulled the MiG into a sharp climb, engines howling, sensors locking onto the pre-programmed coordinates. In those few seconds, Russian radars lit up across the region. Sirens blared. Operators scrambled to react. But it was already too late. The release. At 14:25, the jet's bomb racks clunked open. 2 JDMERS dropped away, their fins unfolding, guidance systems activating. The bombs glided silently, invisible to the naked eye, steering themselves toward the weakest points of the bridge. 22 seconds later, the first impact shook the earth. A blinding flash lit up the riverbank as concrete and steel erupted into the air. A second explosion followed, even more violent, tearing through the central support. The shock wave blasted windows out of nearby houses, throwing Russian sentries to the ground. The bridge buckled. Steel beams twisted, then snapped like matchsticks. A fuel truck caught in the blast erupted into a fireball, sending a column of black smoke hundreds of meters high. Vehicles plunged into the river below, swallowed by the churning water. In less than half a minute, a structure designed to withstand decades of use had been reduced to rubble. The MiG banked hard, dropping flares to spoof incoming missiles, and disappeared back into Ukrainian airspace before Russian commanders had even processed what had happened. The time from takeoff to destruction, 23 minutes. The time Russia had to react, 0. The smoke from the collapsing bridge had barely cleared when the full magnitude of the strike became apparent. What the MiG destroyed in seconds created a chain reaction of paralysis across the entire Russian southern front. The supply chain shattered. That bridge had been the artery through which fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements flowed into occupied Zaporizhia and further toward Crimea. On the Russian side, entire convoys were caught mid-route. Fuel tankers idled on the roadside. Artillery trucks jammed intersections, and armored transports lined up for kilometers with nowhere to go. Drivers sat helplessly in their cabs as smoke billowed on the horizon. Radios crackled with contradictory orders. Some commanders demanded the convoys press forward and find alternate crossings. Others screamed for immediate retreat to avoid Ukrainian follow-up strikes. The chaos grew worse by the hour. Command paralysis. Inside Russian field headquarters, panic set in. Officers tried to reroute supplies to smaller rural roads, but those routes were narrow, unpaved, and vulnerable to ambushes. What had been a 2-hour resupply run now turned into journeys of days, burning precious fuel just to move supplies forward. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already circling overhead, tracked every convoy, turning each rerouted column into an easy target. The Kremlin's regional command faced a cruel dilemma: move supplies through exposed backroads and risk annihilation, or hold them back and leave frontline units without fuel and ammunition. Both options spelled disaster. Attempts at repair. Russian engineering units were rushed to the site. Pontoon bridges were considered, but the damage was too catastrophic. Massive slabs of concrete, some weighing over 40 tons, had collapsed into the river, blocking any temporary crossing. The debris turned the site into a graveyard of steel, impossible to bypass quickly. Worse still, every attempt to send engineers closer was met with the buzzing of Ukrainian drones overhead. Repair crews scattered for cover, knowing they could be struck at any moment. The bridge wasn't just destroyed, it had been transformed into a killing zone. Psychological impact. For Russian soldiers waiting at the front, the news spread like wildfire. Supplies weren't coming. Fuel was running out. Artillery shells were being rationed. The myth of invulnerability, that Russia's vast infrastructure could withstand anything, collapsed with the bridge itself. What had once been a symbol of permanence now stood as a twisted reminder that even the strongest structures could vanish in under half an hour. For the first time, many Russian troops realized, if a single MiG could erase a bridge, what else could Ukraine strike next? With the bridge gone, the Russian army in southern Ukraine suddenly found itself cut in half. Entire divisions that relied on daily shipments of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were left stranded. Artillery batteries began firing fewer shells. Tank units rationed maneuvers, and supply convoys backed up for hundreds of kilometers. Ukrainian forces immediately seized the initiative. Reconnaissance drones scoured backroads, marking stranded convoys for artillery strikes. Partisan groups inside occupied territory ambushed rerouted supply trucks. What had been a steady flow of reinforcements became a thin trickle, vulnerable at every turn. The destruction of a single bridge changed the rhythm of the battlefield across the entire Zaporizhzhia front. The Kremlin's dilemma. In Moscow, the reaction was frantic. Official statements downplayed the strike, claiming the bridge had been damaged and would be repaired shortly. But satellite images told a different story. The central span was gone. Support pillars snapped, and twisted metal littered the river. Repairing it would take months, not days. The Kremlin faced an impossible choice. Should it divert scarce air defense assets from protecting cities like Belgorod and Rostov to cover every bridge and railway hub? Or should it accept that Ukraine now had the capability to strike any critical target deep behind the front lines? Either option exposed a weakness the Kremlin had spent years denying. International ripples. Abroad, the strike became headline news. Military analysts across NATO praised the operation as a textbook example of precision warfare. It showed that even with aging Soviet aircraft, Ukraine could harness Western technology to devastating effect. For allies hesitant about providing long-range weapons, the message was clear. Ukrainian pilots and engineers could use them with surgical efficiency. Meanwhile, in Russia, panic spread quietly among the population. Social media posts showed endless traffic jams of military convoys rerouting through villages, frustrating locals who suddenly found their roads clogged with tanks and fuel trucks. The myth of Russian logistical invulnerability had been shattered in plain sight. A symbol of modern war, perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. For Russian soldiers, the strike proved that nowhere was safe, not even the bridges that had stood for decades. For Ukrainians, it was proof that ingenuity, courage, and precision could achieve what once seemed impossible. In just 23 minutes, a Soviet-era fighter jet carrying 2 precision bombs rewrote the rules of the Southern Front. And as the wreckage of the bridge smoldered, one truth became undeniable. In modern war, it is not the largest army that wins, but the one that dares to strike where it hurts most.